Transcendence. A knight was so moved by the suffering of a beggar that he removed all ornaments from this spear. They were a frightened, diligent people. They would clear the forest and hunt the animals, even when they had no need. They developed the technology to preserve food they were unable to eat, and earned more money than could ever be spent, yet there was not a single one among them who was not except and precise, for none of them knew any other customs. They were frightened and studious people. Their grasp of calculations and science exceeded any perception of practicality, and they would repeatedly engage in spirited debates regarding the production of the future. They invented and increasingly difficult languages and created infinite series of complex machines which they would indefinitely discard. But there was not a single one among them who looked back, for now none of them knew any reason for concern. They were frightenedly obedient people. Without even being told, they would greet the morning sun at the same time, in the same clothes, while toiling away in the same cramped rooms. Yet there was not a single one among them who complained, for none of them knew what else they should be doing. Having worked for too much, the people lost their forest and took to living atop the sands. Having grown far too intelligent, the people conversed in a language that no other people could comprehend. Having grown far too well behaved, these people were unable to defy the laws that would be established one after another, and came to live their lives enclosed by 10,000 rules. Well, honestly, it kind of sounds like the case of the world currently, but then it also does explain why the men of the mask are like how they are. Meant to go to beauty details. Spur of the Usurper. A spear used by a prince's body double to slay his employee. The traitor was later killed with the same spear. In a far-off land, there was a man who acted as a double for the nation's prince, performing his duties in his stead, as well as was required. One day, having finished his work, he returned to the prince's chamber to find the princess lying naked in his bed. As the double stood in place, dumbfounded, the man who shared his face sneered and invited him to join them. The double loved the prince's sister, and he felt that the prince, who admired him as her brother, loved him as well. Indeed, she was the only thing that kept him going in an otherwise miserable job, for the prince was the most deplorable man indeed. Eventually, it came to pass that the war was to be waged under the prince's command. The night before it was to begin, the prince took his doubles aside and promised him a night with his sister if he could bring him the head of the enemy general. And as the prince chuckled with delight, the double took up his spear and thrust it through the prince's gaping mouth. The war was over. The prince made a queen of his sister, and would inflict wounds upon his own face and throat, an act which would occur every time she called out to him using her brother's name. Before long, the prince was found dead, his face burned and a spear thrust through his open mouth. The man's face, hideously burned, was the very picture of serenity. The Devil Queen. a favourite spear of a mad queen whose lust for power led her to kill all her sons' wives. This story takes place in a small country at around the same latitude as the northernmost member of the nation of the city-states that are part of the region within the village that attempts to establish a trade agreement with another village on a tiny island in a sea of the south country that used to be in alliance and coalition where the queen resided. Jesus Christ, that is terrible. It was all asked by the owner of a shop frequented by a nurse. Oh god, this weapon's annoying. By a wet nurse who looked after a child born of an adulterous relationship by a wife of a master of a foolish servant who fell in love with a beautiful queen who appeared in poems of mainstream, who's loved by a country's king's wife, little brothers, cousins, big brothers, son-in-law's foster child. Where does one store the fur that was supposed to be adorned with decorations crafted from materials of the handled lid of a pot that is in the same weight as tableware, that is in the same colour as a weather vane on the neighbour's house, that can be seen from the peephole of the door in the reflection of a mirror with an ornament frame decorated silver carvings engraved in fragments that were made with crafting and whetstone used in the polish of the kitchen knives. The person who heard the question was the wife of the husband's little sister's big brother, daughter's groom, little brother's nephew's father, mother's husband's bride, niece's father-in-law's wife, husband's little sister, big brother's daughter's groom's little brother's nephew, father's mother's husband's bride, niece's father-in-law's wife, husband's little sister's brother's daughters and groomed, little brother's nephew, father's mother's husband's bride, niece, father-in-law's wife, little sister's big brother's daughter's groom, little brother's nephew, father's mother-in-law, hands, maid, niece, father-in-law's wife, husband, little sister's brother's daughter's groom, little brother's nephew's father's. Jesus, it just doesn't make sense. Sunrise. The spear's point is so fiercely honed that all who are grazed by it experience an instant, painless death. Such a sharp spear. In the distant past of the land known as the Golden Isle, there existed a sword crafted from every kind of metal and precious gem in the land, so sharp its edge that even the slightest cut would leave an unsealable wound that would eventually drain the victim of both their blood and life. In a strange turn of fate, the sword eventually ended up in the hands of a distraught woman who sold her body to get by. The sword was as long as she was tall, and she could not wield it efficiently. So instead, she slid it between her sheets as a surprise for the men who used her. The sword was sharp. They felt no pain when cut, and soon died without even knowing what was happening. The woman would then help herself to their coin, causing her own purse to swell. Making use of the gains, the woman dressed most beautifully and soon acquired every kind of metal and precious gem in the land. But it was not enough for her. She decided to melt it down and the sword and obtain the gems contained within. A desire made manifest by the sword's beauty. Thus decided the woman, heaved the sword to her shoulder and made for the blacksmith. But on the way to the smith, the sheer weight of the sword caused the woman to lose balance, and she fell from a bridge into the river below. So unshakable was the woman's greed that she could not bring herself to relinquish her grip upon it. The woman's pale, bloodless corpse was found washed up on the riverside the following day. Beast Curse. A noble lord commissioned the beastly weapons, that the world might stand in awe of his power. So this is the third brother. Long, long ago, in a faraway kingdom, there lived 3 brothers. The youngest was a terrifyingly lazy lad who spent most of his day fast asleep. However, he was every bit as cheerful as he was lethargic, and was beloved by all. When the nation was best upon by a most contagious disease, the young son did naught but laze about the palace, humming to himself all the while. But his cheerful music comforted the townsfolk, so instead of hating him, they sang his praise. "Oh, what a fine young man," they would say. "Just the finest young man you'll ever find." When the nation became embroiled in war, the youngest son did naught but laze about in the palace, telling stories of the good old days all the while. But his fascinating stories helped the townsfolk to forget the horrors of war, so instead of hating him, they sung his praises. "Oh, what an amazing young man," they'd say. "Just the most amazing young man you'll ever find." One day, the youngest son was lazing about the palace as usual, when he realized he could no longer hear the voices of his townsfolk, and he wondered why that might be. He lazed and wondered, and he wondered. He lazed and he wondered. He lazed and he wondered. Eventually, all the wondering tired him out, and he went to sleep. That is why, in the nation where all have perished from the war and disease, the sound that can be heard is the soft snoring of a young man. It's a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness. Captain's holy spear, a spear brandished by a warrior monk chief, who sacrificed his own life to protect his comrades. The captain tramples life under his feet. The screams of others transform into a song of joy. Flowing cheers change from despair into darkness. Conflict beckons revenge and gives way to solitude. That was a very short weapon. The Dragoon lance, a spear that symbolizes peace between the great warlord and an ancient dragon. He had grown old. The king's droughtless gaze had lost its light, and his steward's stalwart body had grown soft. What more, every ounce of fear and vanity he had gained with age now gnawed away at his heart. The king was afraid, so he repeatedly ordered the invasions of neighbouring countries so as to hold the lands he had been sworn to protect. The king was afraid, so he tried to take everything through violence and opposition, for he no longer trusted his own advisors and vassals. There was a dragon that had sworn fealty to the king. The wingless creature would do anything the king commanded it, for he had been saved by the king once, and swore to repay this debt with his very soul. Even if the king orders were folly and madness, the dragon would follow them to the last, for his king was justice itself. One day the dragon requested an audience with the king. He was covered in blood from his latest victim, the king's own son, who the resident had ordered the dragon to assassinate. The bloody dragon hung his head low and said, "I cannot defy your orders, O king, but nor do I obey them any longer. I beg you, kill me and grant me release." This is the tale of a foolish king and a wingless dragon in a nation that fell centuries ago. Even now the wingless blows crest across the grassland. It blows just as it did on the day the king and the dragon made their pact. The Phoenix Spear. Forged by monks from the feathers of a legendary firebird, the spear was designed as a tool of self-defense, and it is the strongest weapon in the game. There was once a warrior in the frontier nation who feared not death. He was so brawny and powerful, arrows were said to bounce harmlessly off his flesh. For this reason, the warrior always threw himself into the thick of any battle. One day, a beautiful bird appeared before the warrior in a dream. The bird complimented the warrior on his valor in battle and offered to grant him 2 wishes. The bird could bring an end to war and grant peace to all world, or the bird could bequeath the warrior an immortal body. The warrior chose immortality, obviously. From that day forth, the warrior exploits were nothing short of astonishing. He moved down foes in uncountable numbers. No amount of arrows or swords or axes could slow his march. The king showered him with titles and gifts, and for a time it seemed the warrior's days of stunning glories would continue until the end of time. But conflict did not cease. Eventually, the warrior's frontier nation was invaded so often that the flames of war left the entire country in ruins. Crops withered, people perished, and before long there was nothing left. There was none left who even knew the warrior's name. The shattered warrior was tortured day and night by endless starvation, but his body refused to let him die. So he sought out the bird again and pleaded for them to grant him release. "Ah, you cannot die," chirped the bird in response. "You will never die. And that's why you should never wish for immortality. It's a bad thing. You really don't want it. It kinda sucks." Forged from a metal of a liquefied beast claw, the destructive spear is filled with a deep hatred for the world. She was a hopelessly slow woman, impossibly clumsy. It would take her 3 times as longer than anyone else to accomplish a task. She walked slowly, talked slowly, she even blinked slowly. So slow was the woman that she could not even draw water to anyone's satisfaction. The children began to call her the cow, and laughed when she passed by, but she would only chuckle in response. She was a hopelessly dull woman. When she fell and drew blood, she would carry on as though in a daze. Through coins often dropped from her purse, she never managed to retrieve one. If someone spoke ill of her to her face, it would take her hours to realize the insult. When the children saw her, they would hurl rocks with glee. She was a hopelessly foolish woman. One summer when the village was suffering a most terrible drought, the woman vanished. The children all starved to death. The villagers spent no time worrying about the woman who ran away. 2 days later, rain fell and the village was saved, but the woman did not return. And on the 20th day, a shaman arrived at the village. The shaman held a spear with a pair of horns that had been oiled and slick to the touch. So heavy was the spear that none could wield it effectively, although even if they managed to lift the weapon, was impeccably unpaired through anything at all. The shaman forced it on the people and left it with them, but none dare approach it, and to this day it quietly slumbers in a forgotten corner of the village. Fool's Accord. A lance birthed as part of a pact with an ancient red dragon. This is the story of a sorrowful prince, a tale of a kingdom in a time long past. Attacked by forces of darkness, the nation was annihilated in a single night by inhuman soldiers with red eyes and a group of black dragons. So numerous they blotted out the sky. Having infiltrated the king's castle, the black dragons visited upon the king in crime. A horrible fate. It is said that their stomachs were torn open by the black dragon's mighty claws, and the very floor they stood upon became a sea of blood. The prince and princess, though racked with sorrow, escaped to live another day. The prince, spurted by the shock of witnessing his parents' tragic end, became consumed by a desire to enact vengeance. This is a story of a terrifying prince, a history of a conflict in a long, long ago. in the long go. Obsessed with laying low his hated enemy, the prince indulged in his vengeance day after day after day. Even when faced with foes who took heel, he chased them and tore them apart from groin to gullet. The carnage is so horrific, his fellow soldiers whispers tales on how he mutilated the bodies that are already long dead. Perhaps because no commander could control him, the prince sent to an even harsher battle. This is the story of a fooled prince, the whereabouts of fate in the long ago. The prince's next battleground is a castle that guards a goddess. He lays waste to it all before him, hacking arms, cleaving legs, rending stomachs, gouging eyes, separating heads from soldiers, but soon the injured prince can no longer tell the difference between the blood that runs down and that which comes from his own wounds, and he collapses in a heap. As he writhes in pain, coughs up gouts of hot blood, he lifts his gaze to see a hatred dragoon standing before him. This is the story of a mad prince, a meeting with a dragon in the long ago. An injured red dragon stands before the prince, and though it is a different colour from the beast that killed his parents, he feels the need to avenge himself upon it regardless. But as he raises his sword, the dragon says, "In exchange for both our souls, human, I will save your life and grant you power." After some thought, the prince makes a pact. It matters not to him what he might lose in the deal, or that it involves a dragon. All he cares about is that he can continue swinging his blade, so he can swing, and with every blow his heart fills with the desire as black as the darkest night. Okay, that's all of them.